I am Michael Marissen, Emeritus Professor of Music at Swarthmore College, and my only activity here will be to be essentially a traffic cop. One of the great issues in Bach studies is the relationship between time and eternity, and I will try to focus as much as possible on time.
I thought I would just begin by talking a little bit about historical performance, historically informed performance. And I think one of the things that we've learnt in recent decades is that it's not really a fixed body of knowledge and practice that once you've learnt it, you've got it, but that it actually continues to move. It's a moving target. And that new generations of performers and scholars will actually see new things in the past and get new inspiration from the past. And it's not just a question of the established sources of performance style or whatever, but also what counts as historical performance. In other words, how broadly do you draw the net around the actual action of performance in terms of context, meaning, audience, and so on. So, in other words, I think we have truly learnt that historical performance is never absolutely correct. There's no such thing, really. And if it was correct, we wouldn't actually know. There wouldn't be a sudden shout from heaven saying, yes, spot on. In other words, history is used as a form of regeneration rather than as a form of correctness. And I think that's something that has really developed recently. And one of the things I think it has led to very strongly is that players and performers throughout the music profession are taking more responsibility for the knowledge of their instrument and how it fits in with other instruments, interest in their own history as performers, and so on. So I think people are becoming more, rather than just learning the techniques of performance, all performers, I think, are beginning to become more interested in the history. And another thing that I think is growing is the sense of stylistic distinction, which history nudges us into doing. So this leads me on to my experience with several modern orchestras, which I often work with. And one thing I have noticed is the fact that Bach is no longer corralled, but no longer corralled into a specialist category just to be played by old instruments, that modern orchestras are now beginning to play Bach, and quite often with a distinction of style compared with other types of music. And I think this is very important because it will contribute in the future to refinding Bach's place within the classical canon as somebody who really has a strong reception in later composers, particularly in the 19th and 20th centuries. So you can now program Bach as part of a historical narrative, if you want to, as part of a program. We can hear Bach more freshly, perhaps, because now orchestras are playing with a greater distinction of style. So you could have a concert that involved, for instance, Bach, Mozart, Brahms, Stravinsky, and each of those would reflect one another, but also bring out different styles of performance. Finally, beyond the concert hall, I think this is a very important aspect of Bach performance, and indeed a lot of historical performance, finding new venues, and history can sometimes teach us about this, the coffee house, for instance, or the cafe in modern times, taverns, the inn or the pub, forms of worship, forms of movement. There are many ways in which we can sort of blend historical knowledge with modern forms of performance which are not confined just to the concert hall. And I think that's a very important thing to do. In other words, I think Bach's music is very transferable, and they're both new and old ways of not just consuming this music as an audience, but also participating as an audience and sort of feeling what's going on with this. And to end with, this of course brings me back to one of my pet topics, which I know many of you also work on, which is the notion of embodiment, Bach and the physical, something that's always tends to be forgotten in traditional Bach research. The notion that this music relates to movement, to flows, to dance, and so on, and the sheer existence that one has as a physical and mental being. I think this is something that Bach, as a composer, does extraordinarily well, and because of the brilliance of the intellectual fabric of this music, we've sometimes forgotten that it also takes into account distance, time, movement, and gesture. And I think that that form of rediscovery is in the process of happening right now. And I think that is one of the most promising directions in which Bach performance and Bach reception and Bach participation will hopefully go in the coming decades.
Thank you very much, and perfect timing, by the way. Okay. Thank you for that, John, and then we'll turn to Michael.
Yeah, John mentioned already so many important points, so it's not really hard to say something after this, but actually what I realized after 5 days Bachfest, Bach for Future, with lots of younger groups performing. Remember, 2 days ago we had the St. Matthew Passion by Solomon Snott. Next Saturday we will have a Vox Luminis with the St. John Passion as a Good Friday Vesper, or as part of a Good Friday Vesper, when we had this amazing Bach Requiem at Lux in the Anatomy Institute. I realized one more time that Bach interpretation, Bach performances, it's always in a move, so it's probably always changing. I mean, looking back 40 years ago or so, when Humankind, Leonard came up with their Bach cantata recordings or passions, or then Gardiner reaching a certain level of perfection, maybe they thought, now we have the original Bach sound back, and that's it. But now, I mean, listening to these recordings of Humankind and Leonard, it gets harder and harder for me. So, because something is always changing, and I'm sure that in 40 years, when we are looking back to the performances and recordings of this time, we also will think somehow that is, for a certain reason, old-fashioned. So, I mean, there's probably only one constant thing, and that's the quality, the power of Bach's music. So they still will play the same notes. But the style maybe will change, the formats. I was totally impressed. I don't know who was there when we had this performance of At Lux in the Anatomy Institute. Anatomy, is that right, English? For those who were not in the concert, a short explanation what was going on there. Julia Sophie Wagner, a Leipzig soprano singer, had the idea of creating a kind of requiem with arias and choirs, choruses from Bach cantatas, and coming up with what we call in Bach scholarship parody practice. She asked a famous German writer to produce a poem that fits very well to certain arias and choirs by Bach. And actually she mentioned, she told me that it was a long struggle with him, because he came up with texts, same metrics and so, but somehow it didn't work. So she had to do a lot of work to bring it under the notes. So she got a taste of how hard actually a parody practice was for Bach and for Picander. So that is really something special. It's not only to come up with rhymes with the same metrics, it's much more than this. So and this was not the typical requiem, a modern interpretation, so about the question what will happen when we die, or what is the meaning of life, and so on. And they combine it with music like Herr, gehe nicht ins Gericht and Bleibt ihr Engel, bleibt bei mir. With the new text, werden wir uns wiedersehen, yeah? Shall we meet us again? So in that all, they told me they want to perform it in the Bachfest, and I said, okay, then let's go to a place where life and death both is there. And we ended up in the Anatomy Institute here in Leipzig University. I came up with this idea because that is a place which plays a certain role in Bach research, because it was in the 1890s that the head of this institute had to analyze the bones, probably by Bach, and in the beginning of our concert, the head of the institute today talked about this story and showed us a model of Bach's skull, So, and after the concert, people were allowed to do selfies with the. So, but that was the funny part. What they created with a new text on Bach's music, very tasteful, was amazing. I saw many people crying in the audience, and so the impact of this performance was very special, very heavy, and in the end, I mean, it was because of the power of Bach's music, of course. I'm not sure if this is really the future of Bach interpretation. I mean, Bach's pieces have a future, and I'm sure they will perform it in 2 years or in 20 years, St. Matthew Passion, also like we are doing it today. But there are many, many more options. There will be many more options, and Bach will stand it. That's it.
Thank you very much, Michel, for that. And then let's turn finally to Margaret.
The HIP movement in itself, in some cases, is a kind of artistic research and has been very active since the mid-20th century. Recordings of 17th and 18th century music by HIP ensembles has been in progress since the 1970s. And it was already mentioned that Hanekor, Leonhardt, Gardner, Kopen, and Suzuki have all recorded complete sets of Bach cantatas. The Nederlandse Bachvereniging is already halfway through the completion of video recordings of all of Bach's works, and you can see this, if you don't know it already, on YouTube, called All of Bach. So after yet another complete recorded set of Bach's sacred music, does this mean we are done with discovering and researching how Bach's church music was originally performed? Do we then turn our attention now and in the future to new audiences, new publicity, new packaging, and new programming? In the present music scene, these are all important issues, but there is still so much to discover through performance itself. Johann Gottfried Walter's frontispiece of his Musikalisches Lexikon in 1732 in Leipzig depicts a violoni player standing, playing a large 5-stringed violoni propped on a small stool next to the church organist. He is using an underhand so-called German bow, and in this picture the time beater is standing between the violonist and the organist. But normally the violoni player would have looked over the shoulder of the organist at his music. There are 2 large violonis still preserved in Leipzig, which were used during Bach's lifetime in the main churches. This is one of the 2 instruments made by the Luthier Prater in Prague. One can just make out, I hope, the widely spaced sound holes, which indicate that the instrument was originally set up with a wider bridge, so something like the engraving on the left here, and probably had at least 5 strings, possibly 6 strings. The violoni is only one small part of the soundscape Bach might have heard in the chapels and churches of Weimar and Leipzig, for example. Yet we have often been playing the same setup in our present HIP performances, that is, a classical or more modern 4-stringed bass tuned in fourths with gut strings. We very rarely have the opportunity of playing concerts of or recording Bach's music standing next to the organ in the organ loft of Baroque churches, and this is through financial and logistic constraints. I can envisage the HIP ensembles of the future making much wider use of video recordings and streaming to bring these possibilities to life to wider performances. Thank you.
I mean, just that final point about the organ lofts. I've done a few of those in Thüringen. For instance, the Eisenach Georgenkirche did a very small cantata, with very small forces cantata, and it's amazing how the focus of the building seems designed to project from that position. I mean, obviously many things must have changed over the centuries, but it was very striking that it had far more impact there than the Passion that we did at the other end of the building, in a certain sense. Also, the organ in Waltershausen, I've done concerts from up in the loft there, and again a very interesting way in which the organ and the big string instruments that you have with it provide an enveloping focus for the whole thing. So very, very interesting, and as you say, new technologies, particularly video, are very, very useful in this regard.
Thank you. If I could add here, we've just finished putting out a recording session from Musica Amphion. It started 12 years ago, I believe, and we were playing in churches that Bach either played in or might have played in. So starting in Arnstadt and finishing in Ponitz. And it was very interesting what John says, the resonance of the church. The first recording we made, we had no idea how that would work. We worked for 3 days recording with the microphones strung up a little way from the balcony. And then we discovered at the end of the week, actually putting the microphones at the end of the church, at the floor, where the congregation obviously would be, worked much better. So we had to start again with it. So you see how much the space is important for the actual total experience of listening to Bach's music.
I can add that we made several times now the experience how much better it sounds in St. Thomas Church if you bring the singers in front of the orchestra. We had it 3 or 4 years ago with the minor mass and the Tolzer Knabenchor, just 24 singers or so, and suddenly all these Stile Antico movements sounded extremely well. So all the singers and instrumentalists, same level, and the same happened now with Herrewege, the Herrewege concert. He arrived here and told us we had no idea that he wants to have the choir in front of the orchestra. That crashed the live stream totally, no chance anymore. But completely different sounds, and many of the acoustic problems we are having in St. Thomas Church were solved.
Yeah, and I mean, from what we know of positioning from 17th and 18th century, it's almost always the case that the singers and even choruses, quite big ones like Handel's, are absolutely at the front. It's only when you get the incredible new culture of amateur choral societies that you have to put them behind, and then it's the sheer weight of numbers makes the impact. So I've even tried this in the Albert Hall a couple of times of having the chorus in front, and it's a difficult acoustic, but those who appreciated it found it good.
If I could add something in here, we also noticed that different instruments sometimes work. In Holland, we particularly detest the viola da spalla, but you notice someone sitting playing a cello behind the balcony doesn't project out very well, whereas a viola da spalla, which has Ferrari as perhaps a coarser sound, projects out beautifully, and this ties in with what Matteson was talking about.
I seem to remember reading an anecdote somewhere about Bach being with one of his sons in a cathedral in Berlin and realizing there was a whispering gallery just by looking at it. So to what extent do you think that Bach understood and knew about all these acoustics of buildings?
I mean, I think part of the way that J.S. Bach was brought up in this sort of sense of craftsmanship, in learning about how to make organs, how to do organs, how to play several different instruments, that sort of all-roundness of learning about acoustics as you learn about how to use your fingers, is something that, you know, we can't quite imagine today, at least at the same level. And I suspect that there is an element of that culture, that apprenticeship culture, that we can't absolutely replicate, but we can at least imagine. And that might well indeed involve an incredible intuition of acoustic and space.
This is a question for John. Yes. I'm just wondering if you could say a little more about the research into the embodiment and the movement aspect that you were referring to.
Right, well, I mean, several people here have done even more than I have. Bettina and Mark have both worked in this aspect, but I have written a little bit about Bach and dance, and the notion of dance as a regulation of something that's intrinsically good, movement, in other words, being good as opposed to bad, which some areas of Christianity saw it as bad. But the notion of actually honing dance and honing movement as a way of controlling your inner urges, as it were, but also relating to other people, is very strong within the dance tutors, not just of France, but also those of Germany at the time, a man called Patsch in particular, and several others in Leipzig itself, writing about this. So it's quite clear that dance was seen, rather like music was seen, as something that, if treated well and organized well, could actually be very beneficial, both for the individual and for the community. And I think this whole side of things is one that has tended to be ignored in Bach scholarship, and it would be very useful to see that. I mean, if you think back to Luther's, I think it was a Georg Grau publication when he said, you know, that this music reminds you of a dance, around a dance in heaven. You can see how music and dance are seen as partners, really, in terms of useful art, or arts which can be used towards the benefit of individual and community.
Hello, thank you very much again. I'm trying to imagine Bach performance in, say, 50 years' time, and we've already been talking about, you know, there was a mention about, you know, Bach parody. During this year's Bachfest, there is, you know, a concert with electronic music as well, and so I'm kind of wondering whether there might be a future in a performance practice that is Bach inspired rather than a reinterpretation of Bach's notes, and to what extent do you think there is room for that to be mainstream in the way that perhaps, you know, historical performance was seen to be a little bit innovative a few decades ago, and has now developed into maybe not mainstream, but at least with very strong traditions of its own?
What we are already realizing today is there are many, many more options to perform Bach maybe than 20, 30, 40 years ago, and maybe it gets broader and broader. And I like this. I'm sure there will still these traditional performances. At the moment, I have the impression that nobody is interested that much anymore in conductors. So all these young ensembles successful, they have a leader, but it's not the classical conductor anymore. And maybe that's a direction which will happen for the next 10 or 20 years, and then maybe they rediscover the conductor in Bach performances, all the advantages or so. I don't know. So I'm sure, I mean, we will have in 50 years a wide variety of dealing with Bach's music and performing the original piece with no things around, so very concentrated, but on the other hand, the idea of coming up with new texts or changing instruments or so, that will still happen, because I mean everybody loves the music, but some people struggling with the texts. But what we have seen in the At Lux performance was that the power of this music is so strong, and if you manage to come up with a new text that really touches people, but at the same time fitting perfectly to Bach's music, the impact can be really wow. I mean, that is this is not what is it, Aufruf, a call for creating new texts for Bach's music, definitely not. But as an option to bring the music closer to a broader audience, I guess that's a good, not the worst idea.
When I listen to Bach's cantatas and oratorios and I look at the words are fine and they're the starting point, but they don't really inform my enjoyment of them. The words are fairly ordinary, the music is magnificent, and from my perspective, far surpasses the words. Last night we went to hear the concert with the Art of the Fugue. There's no story there, there's no libretto. It's a deeply moving performance, pure music. So this seems to me, kind of Bach is pure music in that sense, but you know there is text and gets handed around in the programs. Can you comment on the relationship between text and music and Bach's choral music, and why I should be paying more attention to it than I do?
I think if one thinks of somebody from Bach's time, though, like Scheibel, Gottfried Scheibel, he does say that if something works really well in the opera house and people are really moved by something, why can't you just transfer that and the whole mechanism of the music into the church and put it with a sacred text? So there's a sense in which texts, the link between text and music is a little looser than many people might want to guess. But there's still this notion of the music having obviously a relationship to a broader text, a text of the world, or the text of the universe, as it were. And I think that might be getting also to what you're saying there, that there's a sense of text as something much broader than the words that happen to be there. It's the text of life, the text of our age. And of course, in terms of Bach reception, that meta-text, if one could call it that, just invented that, if you can call that meta-text actually is what changes and what Bach's music amplifies in a certain sense. So yes, it's this issue of the melding and the blending is a really, really interesting one.
We could also think about how non-text music functioned within Bach's time within this theological context, and this idea that even music without text has a text. It's some sort of prayer towards God. It's worship. It's amen. So this idea, it's a bit more blurry, I think, than just absolute or program.
Yes, I mean, it's amazing how this same argument about absolute and program you can trace back to about 1850, 1840, and it's still valid in a funny sort of way. Really very interesting how much music tells on its own. And quite often when you describe what music tells you on its own, you actually end up talking about a text again. So it flips over very easily.
I have two questions. One is from Mark about talking about physiology. I wonder how much volume plays into Bach studies, especially because we live in a world that, I walk around with earplugs in most of the time because things are so loud. And so I wonder how Bach studies has dealt with in terms of volume. And the second question is one for John. You mentioned Bach entering the canon into a new way. And this is a question that I've always sort of harbored, is how much is Bach really in the canon?
Well, let me start with that last one. If Bach was in the canon, if the canon as we know it today and inherit it today began at the beginning of the 19th century, then Bach is, as it were, retrofitted into it right at the very beginning. And you could relate this to various social factors, musical consumption factors, building of concert halls, and so on. So from that point of view, Bach was almost, you could say, like an Old Testament that was absorbed into the emerging classical canon around 1820 and beyond. I heard a performance of Brahms 1 the other week, and I thought, gosh, Brahms couldn't have written that first movement if he'd not heard the opening of the Matthew Passion. As soon as you start to look for this in the canonic so-called composers, you see more and more and more how virtually all of them, it's very hard to think of anybody who is not influenced by Bach, and we were talking about how Bach could be reused in the modern age. Well, in fact, you hear him being reused throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. So I suppose the big, does that answer the canon question enough yet? I suppose this leads into what happens in the future. Does Bach carry on being connected to what we might call canonic music? That's a problem in a way. We have perhaps multi-canon now, which is not just a question of Western classical popular rock, folk music, but also world music. And I suspect we're going to get close to the notion of a multi-canon. But again, given that Bach is so influential on so many people in the pop and composition worlds and the jazz worlds, one might well imagine that he will be consumed, digested, and regurgitated in new ways to come.
I mean, look, at the moment, my impression is today at the Planet, Bach is performed as much as never before. So it's still growing. So
I think I'll answer your question by answering Max's question. I imagine a future in which Bach gets louder and louder, where a Bach concert is not dissimilar from a Beyonce concert or a Coldplay concert. And this is for one main reason, which is musicians don't just invent. They don't just come up with a new way of playing Bach. They're in a context, they're driven by the economy. And in England, at least, they're driven by arts cuts to funding. And so I think if classical music is going to keep up, if Bach is going to keep up this notion of accessibility, of crowds, of volume, is going to enter the equation, I think Bach will get louder.
Well, more and more clavichords are being built, so I suppose it might get quieter as well, in a sort of personal sense. Yeah. So I suspect it'll go both ways, to be honest. Yeah.
Have you been at a concert by Dorothee Oberlinger 2 days ago in the Kupfersaal? So they used the loudspeakers with the lute and the flute, and it worked quite well. And I was really thinking about, coming up with the clavichord and some loudspeakers, and that maybe allows the audience to have the same experience as the player has. Why not? If you have good ones, good. No subwoofer, of course.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's thank our panel then.